And so in secure attachment, we have what we call a positive sense of self in relationship, but then also a positive sense of other. Mm-hmm. In other words, it means, I feel worthy of getting my needs met, and I feel capable of being able to ask for my needs to be met. So that's the positive sense of self. Mm-hmm. The positive sense of other is the person I'm closest to is not only willing to meet my needs, but capable of doing so.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to bring to you today a legacy podcast presentation. It's going to be part one of a three-part series on attachment styles. And this is taking you back to the Men of Valor program days, where we were hosted by Dr. Mark Laaser, myself as co-host, and our special guest for these three attachment shows was the Clinical Director of Faithful and True, Jim Farm. Here now is part one of Attachment Styles.
Today we're going to start what I think will be a 2 or 3 part series, and I've invited one of our counselors here at Faithful and True, Jim Farm, to be with us. Welcome, Jim, to the radio program. You haven't done this yet.
No, this is my first time, and it's a privilege to be with you guys today.
Well, that's good. Jim is a well-experienced counselor. He comes to us after years of practice with some other people, and he's an ordained minister and went to Bethel, and he also is an LMFT. So, right? Am I right?
You're exactly right.
And we consider him just to be an all-around swell guy, which...
well, that's always a prerequisite. I mean, that's a given.
It's a given. You need to be that to be on the show. So
That's right.
All right.
So we were searching around for kind of a new series, new topic, and I was polling some of the groups over the last couple of days in terms of, what kind of topics they would be interested in. And I think one of the main things that comes up in our groups is, issues of relationship and codependency. We've talked a lot about that on this show. But yesterday, Jim and I lead a group on Wednesday afternoon, and the whole issue of relationship and what the clinical community these days calls attachment theory came up. And I thought that it would be great to invite Jim to come and talk with our audience about attachment theory, which is it's just kind of a slightly fancier word for relationship theory. Don't you think? I don't know.
That's right. And a lot of that research comes from John Bowlby's work and Mary Ainsworth, of course, back in the 50s. And so attachment is just a fancy word for the emotional connection between a relationship. A lot of people kind of think about the mother-child relationship when they think about attachment, but just even in the last 10 or 15 years, we're getting a lot more research or knowledge about, attachment plays into our adult relationship.
Well, that's good because, as everybody knows, I've been in the field for 30 years, and we always blame the mother. I mean, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, we have, historically, for a male heterosexual sex addict, but this attachment theory is really a lot about, what a child, even at, very young ages, 1 or 2 or 3, learns about the safety, I think, of relationships. Does that make sense? What's the safety of relationships? That struck me this morning that some of us learn that relationships are not safe.
Yeah. And so we learn this pretty early on as young kids is, some of the research that came out is where they would, take mothers as, in the 50s, obviously they're their primary caregivers in the 50s, and they would put, toddlers in this room with their mothers, and they would kind of see how kids would interact
with their mothers.
Their mothers. And so we learned, basically kids develop one of 4 attachment styles through that research.
Yeah, there was a major part of that I think took place in the 80s, where they would also instruct the mother at some point to leave the room and then come back in and just see how the child reacted to that.
That's right.
Do you remember seeing that?
Yeah. And so basically what they would see is they'd see kids, initially protest that.
Right.
This word attachment often is when our caregiver, our closest connection or our closest attachment figure leaves us, our initial reaction is to protest that.
Yeah, so, we should get right into this. I mean, we only have a half hour. I would say that we should probably just outline for the audience the 4 basic attachment styles. And by the way, there's a great book in the Christian community that came out about this by one of my co-authors, Dr. Tim Clinton, and one of my good friends, Gary Sipsey. And it was originally called Attachments, and now it's being called Why Do We Do the Things We Do? So this is not just a secular theory, this attachment stuff, is it? So
That's right. That's
okay.
right.
Well, I like thinking about it in terms of a quadrant. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
Oh, go ahead then.
Okay. So if you think of a quadrant, four different attachment styles. Within that quadrant, if you can think of in regard to close relationships, how we perceive ourselves in that relationship, and then how we perceive our primary attachment figure. And so in secure attachment, we have what we call a positive sense of self in relationship, but then also a positive sense of other.
For those of you who can use your imagination, and I know the men out there can, I'm talking about the top left quadrant.
Yes.
This just in.
Yes.
I know that our listeners can imagine this.
So if you can imagine that, the top left quadrant, so positive sense of self, positive sense of other, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. In other words, it means, I feel worthy of getting my needs met, and I feel capable of being able to ask for my needs to be met. So that's the positive sense of self. Mm-hmm. The positive sense of other is the person I'm closest to is not only willing to meet my needs, but capable of doing so.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we're not just talking about marital relationships, we're talking about any and all relationships, right?
That's right.
It's kind of a positive sense, though. I can be alone and okay as long as I have my relationship with God, and I choose to be in relationship with safe people, basically, I think.
Yeah.
So this is the good one. This is the one we all want.
That's right.
How many people do we think actually have this?
Well, I know originally the research showed that, is about 60-40. But I think the research is coming down. I think it's matching almost the divorce rate in the country, where it's 50-50.
50-50? Okay, yeah. So there would be 50% secure, and the other 50%, the 3 unhealthy ones that we're going to get to here in just a second.
That's right.
Okay.
Just a side note, I think the research that I think we talked a little bit about yesterday, I think the guy that did the research in regards to our community, the sexual addiction community, I think the research in terms of the insecure attachment, one of the 3 other forms of attachment styles, I think it's around 95%.
So we have a pretty unhealthy population of people when they first come in here. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
In terms of doing relationship.
This is one of those things, audience, that you don't like hearing, but it is probably true.
Yeah, and I think, that's part of the sexual, addiction definition, where they talk about intimacy disorder.
Yeah, that's right. That's been a term used ever since the beginning days. Now, by the way, with this 95%, are we only talking about the addicts now, or are we talking about the wives also?
Well, the research that I'm referring to, they just researched the addicts. But,
Okay.
but going with that, we would just assume,
Well, wait a minute. We got a lot of wives listening. Don't assume anything. We'll be getting emails.
That's right. But just from the other research we're aware of, oftentimes what we'll see is one of the insecure forms of attachment we often couple with someone else with that other form of insecure attachment.
So in other words, you're saying, like we've said for so many years, an addict and a spouse is like they're heat-seeking missiles,
Yes.
and it may be 2 unhealthy attachment styles looking for each other.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Well, do you want to go to the next one then, which in this quadrant thing is the top right?
The top right. So we're talking about ambivalent.
Well, you might be, but I usually talk about avoidant.
You go to avoidant first.
Yeah.
Okay. So avoidant attachment style has to do with where we have an overemphasis upon self and a negative emphasis upon other. In other words, there's an overemphasis upon my own needs being met and a sense of that the other person's not there for me. And
That's
so,
right. Yeah.
And so usually this comes out of families where there's restrictive parenting. Rejection is high in this type of family. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's a preoccupation with one of the parents in terms of their own needs rather than the kids' needs.
Could this be a situation where there's emotional incest going on?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So say a little bit more about that, because that's quite a prevalent dynamic that we see here a lot.
Yeah. Well, if you could think of it from a parent-child situation, if you can imagine, little Johnny's, crying, he's having a tantrum, and mom's trying to comfort him, and eventually, little Johnny is not calming down. And mom is going, gosh, you're making this so difficult for me. You know, she's internalizing it in herself rather than focusing on what's the kid need in this situation.
Well, it's kind of reversing the roles, really, isn't it?
That's right.
The needs of the parent are supersede the needs of the child.
That's
And
right.
The child is expected, even at very young ages, to emotionally take care of the parent.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So basically, the core belief that comes out of this is I don't need anybody else, basically.
That's right. Others aren't accessible and others aren't safe. And so avoidant attachment, oftentimes they kind of down-regulate their autonomic nervous system. In other words, they...
Oh, wait a minute.
So
You're
they-
talking to our...
How do you spell that?
Okay. In other words, they shut down their emotions and their needs.
Yeah, down-regulate. That's
That
what
they
you meant.
down-regulate.
Okay.
That's right.
I'm just trying to translate this. so-
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of this is about effective regulation, but you're talking about the fact that they just shut down. So they're the ones who would seem distant and cold and unavailable, that kind of thing.
That's right.
Oh, by the way, as a reminder, our special guest is Jim Farm, and Jim is one of the talented therapists and counselors that we are lucky enough to have on staff here at Faithful and True. And Jim is going to sit in on a couple of shows with Mark and me, and hopefully discussing this hot topic.
Right, so back to the quadrant. Or did we finish with avoidant, do you think?
Yeah, I think we did.
Okay. By the way, those of you that are listening might be self-diagnosing, which I encourage you to think about. But I would discourage you from thinking about diagnosing your spouse at this point,
Highly recommended.
which would be a temptation.
Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead.
One of the things I should mention, we kind of talked about this yesterday, Mark, is, it's often thought of is that maybe we've just developed one attachment style. But it's highly likely that we may have developed an attachment style with our parents that may have been one of the forms of insecure attachment, but luckily enough to have a grandparent that we learned secure attachment with.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so many people that go through here that say that if it weren't for my grandfather, I would have been a lot worse off, or grandma, that kind of thing. You're right. So it's partly, I guess, because, grandparents are older, wiser, and they kind of learn to relax and let go a little bit more than parents do.
Yeah.
Particularly when it comes to the next attachment style, I think, which is a lot about the mother over-controlling.
Yeah. So we're talking about the ambivalent, anxious, preoccupied attachment style. So it's kind of described in both those terms in the literature.
Right.
But that comes from this perspective that, a negative sense of self. I'm not worthy of getting my needs met. I'm not capable of getting my needs met. And there's an overemphasis upon the other person. And so this usually comes out of an environment in which there's parental inconsistency. So sometimes I'm there, sometimes I'm not.
The times that they're there could mean that they're kind of over-controlling. Would that not be true?
Yeah, that definitely would be true.
Okay. Yeah, I remember a story that my daughter was telling me. They were doing a birthday party for my youngest grandson, Devin, and Sarah had set up going bowling and laser tagging, and then they were going to come back to the house, and all the mothers were dropping the kids off at the house and, glad for the time away. And this one mother led the boy up to the front door, holding his hand, and Sarah, met them there and said, yeah, you can pick him up at 6 o'clock or whatever. And the mother said, no, you don't understand. I'm going to stay. And so she did. And she proceeded to the bowling alley, to tie his shoes for him. I don't know what she did in laser tag, but the worst part of it was she came back to the house and actually spoon-fed him the ice cream and cake.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so again, the core belief of this is that I can't be alone and okay.
Yeah.
Would that be true?
There's self-doubt.
Yeah.
There's self-doubt. And often what we'll see is, if they're in a relationship with an avoidant, adult relationship now, with an avoidant type attachment spouse, they will, kind of in contrast to the avoidant person who kind of over-regulates their emotion or kind of stuffs it or suppresses their feelings, anxiously attached folks will kind of up the ante, so to speak.
They will get really emotional.
They'll get really emotional
Yeah.
in order to get a response that they're wanting or that acceptance that they're needing. And ironically, it usually pushes the person away. So the thing that they're looking for is usually getting pushed away in regards to how they're responding to that.
Right. You were saying that, it's not uncommon then for, this attachment style to be in a relationship with an avoidant attachment style. Would that be true?
I would say that we see that pattern quite a bit.
And I think this is the pattern that comes closest to what has historically been described as codependency. Would that be a fair statement, do you think? Okay.
Yeah. And I think, Patrick Carnes at one point, I don't know where he said this or wrote about this, but he often talked about codependence as this compulsive attachment.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but the next time I see him, I'll have to ask him about
Let me
this.
get him on the phone.
Well, I could do that, I suppose, or I could try. I do have his cell phone number, but in the middle of the show, probably not. So, but I promise our audience I'll check this out if that's really important to figure that out. But Pat Carnes is not always, the wife community has not always liked some of the things he's had to say about this. But anyway, maybe we should talk about number 4, kind of go from there.
Okay. So number 4 is the attachment style we often see from people who've experienced a lot of abuse growing up. And so originally I think they called it disorganized attachment.
Right.
One of the newer names they have out there is anxious avoidant, because we kind of see it play out in kind of both the other 2 forms of insecure attachment. These folks will kind of at times look like they're anxiously attaching, and then other times it'll be that avoidant attachment. So oftentimes the description of borderline would come into play here.
You would mention a word that strikes fear in the hearts of all therapists.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think that's the reason I say that is sometimes that's been diagnosed, I think.
Borderline has been diagnosed.
It's been diagnosed where, maybe it has more to do with attachment and attachment trauma rather than, actual diagnosis of borderline.
Well, as you're saying, these people were, in all likelihood, profoundly sexually or physically, perhaps also emotionally, abused growing up. So
That's right.
they learned that the attachment wasn't safe.
That's right. So they learn, going to the quadrants again, they learn what we call a negative sense of self, but also that negative sense of other. In other words, I can't trust myself, to get my own needs met. I don't feel worthy to get my own needs met, and I certainly don't trust, my caregiver to be capable nor willing to meet my needs.
Or my partner.
Or my partner. That's
Yeah.
right.
And this is what will, I think, seem frustrating in relationship because, on the one hand, it would seem like, this person really wants a relationship, but then when attempts are made to get closer, they will somehow back away or sabotage it or just shut down, right? So
Yeah. Attachment styles, the way we kind of see them come into play is usually when an external stressor comes into the relationship or conflict comes into relationship.
Okay.
Then that's where we usually see this attachment style come into play in terms of relationship.
do you think of an example of an external?
That's what I was just going to ask. What kind of event would trigger that?
Yeah. Let's just say, for example, we get a letter about a financial hardship that comes into a couple's relationship, right? So it's an outside stressor. Avoidantly attached person might just say, well, I'm just going to deal with this on my own. I'm not going to talk to my spouse about this. If the other spouse finds out about it, so if it's anxiously attached, they typically will go towards the spouse, attack them. So we have this language John Gottman used to talk about in terms of, turning towards behaviors, which is kind of secure attachment, or turning away, which is this avoidant attachment, or turning against, which is more of this anxious attachment. So when this outside stressor comes in, we'll see a couple from the insecure attachment kind of do this turning away and turning against, where securely attached couples will turn towards each other and try to work this issue out.
Work this out as companions.
That's right.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I have a friend and colleague, Dr. Ralph Earl, that I wrote a book with called The Pornography Trap. But back in the 80s, before I think this attachment theory was popular, he wrote a book, and the title is, I think, indicative of what we're talking about here. It was Come Here, Go Away.
Yeah.
So we need to wrap up for today.
Yeah, I was just seeing where this was going to go here as Jim hit that fourth quadrant, and but it is clear to me that our listeners are going to appreciate this series, and we can't thank you enough for joining us. This is fun to have you with us.
Oh, I appreciate being with you guys for sure.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to this next week and because I know a lot of couples listen to our show, and we don't want to leave them hanging about, now they've been given permission to diagnose themselves in terms of one of these 4 styles. So let's come back next week and talk about some proactive things you might do if you want to get to that secure attached place.
Excellent.
Thanks for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. This has been part 1 of a 3-part series on attachment styles. We look forward to bringing the 2nd and 3rd installments of this series to you in the coming weeks. Until then, we'd like to thank you for being a loyal listener and viewer of our podcast. We also invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources available to you, as well as information and registration for our upcoming Men's Journey workshops, our Women's Journey workshops, and our Couples Journey workshops. All that information and registration is available at faithfulandtrue.com. Until we meet you next week, we hope that the coming week for you will be filled with many blessings and with great vision.